This discussion is about facts and about values, about evidence and values. Apparently in the last 25 years or so, there's been a way of being polite in politics. We're post-idealistic. We're not supposed to squabble or be rude about our values anymore. We're supposed to try to agree on the facts. Problem is we can't always agree on the facts. We often don't agree on who the experts are or what the right questions are to ask, let alone what the answers are. You'll know the feeling that can't be right. That doesn't gel with what I know about the world. Well, apparently we all do that, and that can actually make politics seize up. We can be more polarised when we try to agree on the facts. An example in our own community is that MAPS and the Australian equivalent PRISM and the Council for Spiritual Practices have been working very hard to create evidence that we can all finally agree with. So, and this is a way of making us visible in the allowed area of political discourse. We need to create the facts we know are real so that we can talk about them and influence policy. And I guess what we'll be exploring is what are the limits of working with evidence in the political arena? Do we also need to have a discussion about values? And are there risks in talking about values in drug policy? So would someone like to start? Stephanie, you were amused by the idea of being polite in politics.
Yeah, I think I find myself doing it when I talk about drug policy and finding that place where I think arguing, for example, for harm minimisation, which is one where it's really easy to get the mainstream to agree that we need to manage drugs in a way that creates less harm. But this also creates a compromise in where my real opinion is that I find it really hard to stand up and say, well, actually, why are drugs legal in the first place? And there's a valid and legitimate benefit and experience to be had through taking these substances. I think perhaps with all the shifts that's been happening recently in the media, the popular opinion about drug law policy, maybe it's time that we can actually start saying, what is the basis that drugs are illegal on anyway? And actually, it's a legitimate way to experience reality and consciousness and stop being so polite.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have to agree with that, Stephanie, and certainly for me, working in the drug research area where we work in public health, and in public health we have to think about the harms and we weigh up the harms, and what I always find really interesting is exactly that, the question around benefits. Does that even occur in the conversation? Just a little vignette. A few weeks ago, I actually attended a conference called Cannabis, Where to From Here. There was a little symposium. It was an academic symposium, lots of professors. And in fact, they started off the conference by saying, look, we're not going to talk about harms. We've had that discussion for a long time. What we're going to talk about is how can we go from the system we currently have, which is broken, to a better system, and what might that system look like in terms of cannabis. So that was exciting for me to see lots of ageing professors talking in this way and saying that what was actually stopping them was the political environment, and then talking about how we might see particular windows of opportunity in that environment. They were talking about how can they present the evidence in a way that will make a difference, and the thought I had was, well, when are we going to start talking about the benefits? So, yeah.
So, Monica, would you be looking for evidence of benefits? Like, how would we measure benefits or define benefits? Is that an area where we need to go to evidence?
Well, there's that issue you spoke of before around, how do we define what evidence is, which evidence counts, what questions are we asking? So, who controls the questions we're asking? And sometimes people will think, the researchers will control the questions we're asking, but as you all know, research has to be funded. So unfortunately, there are certain questions that are less likely to be asked, less likely to be funded. So that creates this bias towards the negatives.
I think that it's definitely worth noting that some of the research that's being done recently by CSP, for example, as you mentioned, is doing exactly that in a way that hasn't been done anywhere near as well prior to this. Their recent research with psilocybin is just amazing in terms of actually coming up with scientific, proven extremely well done research with very interesting results about benefits.
Where they're not addressing issues of medical utility. They're not fixing a problem that people have. They're taking people who are healthy and trying to provide them additional benefit.
I think that's a great thing about the organisation like MAPS and PRISM, because they're not funded by companies and they're not corporate funding. When it's philanthropic funding, people like us who are supporting these organisations, that's why it's so important for us to support these organisations in whatever way we can, because then we are able to allow the experiments and the scientific validation of the things we already know take place. And once those things we already know to be true are then scientifically documented, it validates our argument of saying that actually there are real benefits to be had by taking certain substances in certain ways, and that's a legitimate way to be an adult in society.
A friend of mine keeps reminding me that sometimes we just want to get smashed.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, do we need to pretend that we're doing it for spiritual reasons in order to inhale?
I think if we look back through history, you'll find that the earliest writings ever found buried in dirt talk about people altering their states of consciousness with substances. So it's an aspect of human nature. It's something that's been consistent throughout history, and at various times different ways of altering our consciousness have been in favour and out of favour. So I think one of the potential improvements we can make in Western society at the moment is to slowly tweak things so that we start to appreciate the benefits of altered states of consciousness in general, and start teaching our children about altered states and the usefulness of altered states, so that when they come to start experimenting with substances, they have some structure to follow. I think that the main problem in terms of harm at the moment is that we say that altered states are bad, yet we go and drink ourselves into oblivion, and the kids watch us. And then when they come to experiment with altered states, they had no education, they don't understand about substances, there's no structure or context for their use, and consequently there's harm that doesn't need to be there.
So you're suggesting that even if we get smashed, we could get smashed in ways that are less harmful and perhaps have more benefits?
I think if you look at the change process, and this goes back to what I was talking about in my talk just before, the research of Claire Graves shows that when we go through change, particularly transformational change, getting into altered states is in one sense what it's all about, because it's about breaking out of an old paradigm, it's about having insights, it's about deconstructing our old beliefs and making space for new ones. And there's no better way to do that than getting into an altered state. Now, an altered state may simply come from sitting in the bush on a log and pondering, but it can also come, of course, in accelerated ways from substances.
What occurs to me is what makes the difference between harmful inebriation and benefits is often culture. And I'm puzzling about how culture appears for policymakers. I think policymakers are reluctant to rely on culture. Does anyone have?
I think you'll find that at this time in history, policymakers will be looking at culture from their own stage of development, their own worldview, and what fits with their worldview is good and what doesn't fit with their worldview is bad. And they'll tend to bias towards their own worldview, and that's what brings conflict in politics, of course.
I think one of the drawbacks there as well is that policymakers aren't only making policy to fit in with their own worldview, they're making policy to fit in with the perceived worldview of the voters. And that's often directed by, sometimes they're wrong as well, I think, but it's also directed by corporate funding and also media opinion, and then what the popular opinion is of the things they're making decisions about.
Yeah.
I think that's where, to really affect change in drug policy, we need to really be looking at what strategies we can employ to change just the mass opinion. And, the thing of saying that drugs are bad is something we need to challenge. And I think looking at the fact that really you can consider the drive to experience all the states of consciousness as another drive akin to hunger, thirst, sexual arousal, fatigue, and that it's actually just a normal part of being human or being many other animals as well. And if we can somehow target the mass opinion in these things, then we will see policy change eventually.
Yeah. And I think even if we can't necessarily very quickly convince politicians that the drive to get high is on par with the drive to eat, I think that there's also a way of doing a comparison with other recreational activities which are completely accepted, so that it's on par with rock climbing or skydiving, which have clear risks and not necessarily any clear benefits that are proven through scientific research, but which are perfectly accepted because the harms have been identified and have been clarified enough that people can be taking them on knowingly, and therefore the decisions are considered rational in some reasonable way.
I'm sure there are people on this panel who are more in the know than I am in terms of statistics, but if you look at the amount of harm in society that's caused by legal substances, I think it far outweighs any harm caused by illegal substances, so that the whole argument that we have a system based on harm minimisation is false.
But some people use that argument the other way, so they say, well, we need to keep these substances prohibited because if we let them out, which is silly in the first place, but because they're already out there, but if we didn't prohibit them, then they would have the same capacity as alcohol and tobacco to cause, so that gets used both ways.
But on one hand, you've got a fact based on historical occurrence, on the other hand, you've got someone's idea that suppose if we do this, it may happen. So it doesn't stack up to me.
Prohibition doesn't make any sense.
And especially when you consider that the whole concept of prohibition and making certain substances illegal to take on your own as an adult is a really new concept. And I'm amazed how many people don't seem to realise that, just in the general public, that they think that drugs have always been illegal and to legalise cannabis would be this incredibly revolutionary idea, when it's only been, I think, 80 years that idea ever occurred in the first place.
Yep.
And, to remember that.
One of the problems that I see in terms of the trying to have the values of, I'll just say this community, although I'm sort of new to this community, so I don't really know who you people are. But is that I think that there's a long way to go in terms of the evolution of the culture to figure out what appropriate forms of use are, so that, like, one of the problems in the sort of the psychedelic community in the United States is that once you open the door to the use of psilocybin mushrooms or cannabis or something like that, it's not clear that where the lines can be drawn. Like it's clear in kind of the mainstream culture that recreational drug use is bad, but once you're in the psychedelic community, what isn't appropriate? Where is the line where, is the person injecting heroin or methamphetamine at the psychedelic trance party, is that acceptable, and why not? And how do we teach the next generation? What is the learning for the next generation that not just transmits a value, but transmits a set of kind of loose guidelines or something? It's not clear, because if we're talking to mainstream people who ask the question of sort of what's okay and what's not okay, it's extremely difficult to answer.
I think the first step there has got to be simply what works, and that is what works for the individuals who are doing whatever they're doing. And then out of that first step will come eventually a new social standard, where people agree on what works and there's a general sense of it. Yeah.
That also makes me think of a larger question, which is, what is the purpose of the law, and what do we need laws about drugs to do? And I think there's that line between, do we need to decide what's acceptable and enshrine that in law, or can we just accept, or do we decide that what's acceptable is different for each person, and as long that the law just needs to protect the greater society without unduly infringing upon the rights of the individual. And maybe it's okay for us to have the choice that if I want to be shooting up methamphetamine on the floor at a dance party and I feel okay with that, then that's okay. Or maybe, is it up to us as individuals to draw those lines in our communities? We're outside the law, that we don't need the law to do that for us, or do we need the law?
Yeah, I think, Stephanie, you've touched on amongst us here, we've all touched on what are the three classic forms of authority identified in sociology. As to say, the authority from law, and the authority from the individual's charisma, and the authority from tradition, where that charisma has been tried over generations and best practice has emerged as tradition. So there are three different places that we can draw authority from, and they all have their realms of applicability. But we can't expect rationalistic law to be the best form of authority for all situations that we encounter. Sometimes that choice is the best individual.
I'm interested in the idea that the law should be rational, and the possibility that we should be irrational, or we could be irrational. And one example of this is crystal healing. I've heard rumours that the World Health Organization would like to ban crystal healing because there's no scientific proof that it works. So we've got to protect the consumer from people who claim that it does. And this is really, I think, very rational law, saying that not only do we have to be, not only does the law need to be rational, but all of us need to be rational as well.
I think the world's going through a lot of change at the moment, obviously. And often during times of change, people, when something that is current at the moment seems to be not working or they think it's bad, then often the first response is to go back to what used to work in the past. And so we're seeing at the moment a lot of retrograde thinking. So, okay, this isn't working. Well, what did we used to do before? Let's try that and see if that works. And usually when that happens, and particularly if that old way is brought into effect, it actually makes things worse. That's the normal course of events. And making things worse is a constructive thing eventually because it makes the whole system collapse from which something new can arise.
So you're suggesting that we should ban crystal
Probably
healing and ban a few other things just to ramp up the tension
I'll vote for that.
and bring on the revolution.
That's it. Bring on the collapse.
I think hopefully that there are ways for the laws to be rational, though that is one rational form of thinking about how laws should work. I think that there are better ways that the laws can be rational that don't result in crystal healing being banned. So I think that one could have some sort of legal, just off the top of my head, one could have a requirement that things that have healing methods that have no scientific evidence behind them could require that be stated. But you can still allow them.
Every building, essentially, in California has a labeling sign that says that, this building contains chemicals known to the state of California to cause cancer.
Really, every building.
All the grocery stores, essentially every shop. So you could do that. You could just have the Crystal Healing Center could say that this.
It's not been evaluated by the FDA.
I can imagine a form of advertising saying, this therapy, scientists don't think that this therapy works. And that would draw a certain kind of consumer, I think, to want to try it.
I'd just like to point out that with scientific authority too, we're often dealing with willful ignorance, or at least just plain old-fashioned ignorance on issues. I gave a talk on the spirituality of DMT use in Australia to an interdepartmental seminar, and I had a pharmacology professor who testifies in court on drug issues. And he told me that DMT, as it was structurally similar to methamphetamine, would therefore be addictive and reinforcing in the same way that methamphetamine is. He said that methamphetamine and DMT were analogous to each other. And I thought, well, yes, but DMT is also analogous to melatonin, which kicks in at night, rather than dopamine, which kicks in our bodies during the day. So they are similar. They're as similar as night and day. But this is a professor of pharmacology who provides expert testimony in courts in drug prosecution cases.
For a fee.
And that comes back to the original question on evidence-based drug policy and who are the experts and who are the people who are given a valid voice to talk about these issues. And it's rarely people who actually have real experience in these things. I think, and then there's an underlying problem that I see is a part of the scientific paradigm the way it is now is they seem to have forgotten one of the earliest tenets of science, which is to always assume you don't know. And it's become the opposite, where scientists assume that everything they know is absolute concrete truth, even though every 10 years what was concrete truth 10 years before is disproved and there's a new concrete truth. And there's no real allowability for questioning the correctness of scientific opinion at the current time.
And I guess I'd just like to remind the panel that I had the example of the Council of Spiritual Practices, who knows that something is true, and they do wonderful, careful experiments to make that truth available in the political discourse. How important is it that we do that? When will we have enough evidence?
Well, I think one of the things that having solid evidence that one can talk about and doesn't the way that the evidence was generated doesn't scare mainstream people is that it provides cover for people who want to be able to say the thing already. So if you, I mean, one of the things that's, to me, that's kind of, that I just keep in mind when I think about a lot of the way that science works, is a lot of what science is doing is not actually generating, in at least medical science, is not generating new knowledge. You're actually just validating something that someone already knew, and you set up an experiment to try to show it. And so the idea, like, for instance, that the Council on Spiritual Practices sponsored research at Johns Hopkins where they're giving psilocybin to normal, healthy people, is that they are showing that psilocybin can induce mystical experiences in people. And that's not exactly groundbreaking news to anybody who...
But of course it's presented in the media as though it's groundbreaking news. Oh, imagine this. They've been able to, whatever, 70% of people had a mystical experience. We all know that.
Yeah, you give people a lot of psilocybin mushrooms, and it turns out that they get really, really high.
There was a headline in Australia recently on the newspaper saying, magic mushrooms can make you a better person.
Yep.
So if that evidence is available to us, what should we do with it? And at what point should we stop arguing about the facts? At what point should we start saying, look, this stuff is worth doing?
I don't know where that point is exactly. It has certainly been our view and one of our primary goals as we've worked on Erowid to provide a groundwork so that everyone is working from the same facts. That's long been one of the things we've said, that if we could just get the politicians and the EGA attendees to be able to be referring to the same effects of DMT versus methamphetamine, then we would at least be better off than we are now. And so for myself, I don't think we're yet to the point where we all agree on the facts enough that we're not working at that level. But I don't know when I think we will reach that level.
The thing I really love about entheogenesis is it allows us to have a direct experience and to know through that. So once you've had that direct experience, evidence doesn't really matter. And I think that we should try and bring that reality, that vibration, forward into society and act from that place rather than going back into the less complex, simplistic and essentially less evolved ways of problem solving which involve gathering evidence and presenting it and discussing it, to be really honest.
Are you suggesting we spike the coffee at Parliament House?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm wondering if we're debating certain states of consciousness and some people are drug naive, what voice do they have? Should we challenge them on that and say you can't talk about this unless you've tried it?
But who is drug naive when you consider the definition of drugs?
Yeah, exactly.
And you go out from that and you see that all substances that change our consciousness are drugs, and obviously we could talk about the definition of drugs, but there is this line that is constructed between what are currently illicit and what are currently illicit drugs that there are people out there that have had an entheogenic experience using alcohol. That can be done. It depends on the context. So I think what I find when you're in that research situation where you can't openly talk about your own experiences with illicit materials, you can always say, well, but we all use drugs. Let's bring it out to that, because we can all then talk about that a little bit more openly. It's a shame that we can't just all talk about it in some settings, some of the currently illicit drugs.
Why can't we? How might we create that space?
I've been grappling with that question for a long time, and I have this feeling of just wanting everyone to stand up at the same time, everyone in the world to just rise up at once and say, we're all here, we've all done this is not right. And it especially comes when you have a friend who gets arrested and it comes back to earth that this is happening to people all the time, every day. They're going to prison for this simple, normal, and we know it's normal from history, from sociology, from all the disciplines. We can say this is a normal thing that we're doing.
I'm not sure. I don't actually know because I looked and could not find the information what the demographics look like in Australia for people who are 50 and over. But in the United States, part of what I think is just a necessary process is that the current top-level officials in the United States need to die off. Where we're at right now is that in people in their 50s are people who were in high school in people in the 50s and 60s are people who were in high school in the 60s and 70s. And in the United States, there was a giant demographic bump in the late 70s, so that there is about 90% of the population in their 50s have used an illegal drug in their lifetime. And that is not acknowledged at all. I mean, 90% is a very large number. And so it's still not okay to admit that to a large degree. I mean, Obama did admit that, and Bush didn't exactly admit that. But there is, I think, basically just another 10 years need to go by so that the people who are kind of at the top levels of power need to move out. And I think there's maybe some opening that will happen then.
Yeah. I think you're right, but I think it's going to happen a lot more quickly than that. I saw when Steve Jobs passed just recently, there were a number of mainstream articles talking about his LSD use and how it had inspired his creativity. So I think we're living in a time of rapid change, and I would expect within a couple of years that we'll see significant change in public opinion.
I admire your optimism. I'm a bureaucrat. I work in a government department up in Queensland. When I'm at a meeting and I have an idea and everyone says, gosh, that's a really good idea, and I say, well, that's probably the acid I dropped on the weekend. I know that the other people in the room haven't had entheogenic experiences. No matter how drunk they've gotten, there's something that they just don't see. And I wonder whether we can count on them someday seeing it, or their kids seeing it, or is there some sort of discussion we can have with them, saying that this is not a utilitarian world, there's more than just eating and sleeping and going to work. Do we need to have that discussion?
Yeah, I've learned through experience that you can't force people to change. You have to let change happen at its own pace. But the research I was speaking about earlier says that a large part of that change is driven by life conditions. So when you live your life sitting in an office full of bureaucrats, having bureaucratic conversations, then you're going to have a bureaucratic mindset pretty much until those life conditions change. But one of the amazing things that is happening at the moment, so you need to get a new job, mate. One of the amazing things that's happening at the moment is, though, our technology is connecting us in an extraordinary way, and the internet and all the devices we've got for connecting to it is undercutting a lot of old worldviews, and we're seeing the collapse of our economic system primarily due to that connection, because the economic system works on a mindset that is like a gambler that has a hand of cards and doesn't want to show its cards. But when everything's connected and everybody's got webcams on their shoulders, you can't hide that stuff anymore. So if you're selling bad securities, people find out. And that kind of disclosure, because of the connectivity, is collapsing our economic system at the moment. And even the European Union is constructed around a more advanced worldview again, stage 6 pretty much. But even that's starting to collapse because it can't cope with the problems being created by the collapse of the other systems, such as economics, etc. So we're getting towards a kind of combination effect that's where we're going to have a whole bunch of systems that all get wobbly at the same time, and that is the archaic revival that Terence was talking about, and those people sitting in the bureaucratic office are going to read the papers one day and say, man, how did this happen?
Do you think that economic collapse is going to bring about a faster change in drug policy?
I think it could.
The economic collapse is a symptom of changing worldviews and changing life conditions, and those changes will bring different attitudes towards drug policy, yes.
I'm European. I love Europe. I'm a gay man. Europe is a good place to live for homosexual people. One of the tensions that's coming at the moment is that the multiculturalism in Europe is actually not going forward. In a lot of ways, we're becoming less tolerant, under tension, and also with the particular mix of cultures that are coming from all over the world.
Yeah.
So again, I admire your optimism, but I'm just wondering, is there stuff that we can do or should do to make sure that culture moves the way we need it to, rather than just waiting for people to die or waiting for it to happen?
So that dynamic you've just described is the one I was talking about before, where when current systems start to fail, the instinctive thing people do is to go back to the old ways to see if they will work, because they used to work before. And so with the collapse of things like the EU, we're seeing people going back to their old cultural national identities to see if that will work. But because the life conditions have changed, they won't work. You know, they might try and make them work for a short time, but they'll eventually not work at all. And the very best thing that we can do is to reinforce what's emerging, is to do exactly what we're doing here, gather together to create communities of people who are beyond the old thinking, who are looking for the new systems, to find solidarity in the way that people who are behind the Occupy movement are showing their faces in the world. And it's happening, and it's happening damn quickly. And, I think go with the flow is what I'm saying. Yeah.
I agree that I think that what needs to be done, more, I think, is always better and more effective, are all of the things that are being done to some degree. We need better evidence that everyone can agree on. We need better research that's proving what all of us already know. We need the people at the conferences pushing the far boundaries that we have no chance at this moment of getting mainstream media or the mainstream politicians or the mainstream people to have any real understanding of, but they all go on at the same time.
I think the sharing what, for people at the conference, just sharing what works and what doesn't work for people, so that, because I think, to the way that I experience the world when I read the books and the papers and things, is that we really are, as humans, faced with a radically changed profile of what we have available to use as tools for our minds and bodies. And so I don't think it's obvious how humans should relate to this enormous availability of both pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical drugs. And so it's not obvious to me that we really know what the right thing is. As a group, as a big group, as the planet-sized group. And so for people here and people who have had success and have had positive experiences and know where the edges are, sort of don't do that's a bad idea, and this over here is a good idea, is to me the way forward.
I think that's also really positive what you were saying about the politicians, that now people in their 50s have had experience with illicit drugs. I think that's another thing. As this kind of culture matures, there will be the elders who become in their 60s and 70s who will be able to guide the younger people, and that is how we create a culture. And I think creating, as you were saying, a culture where we do have culturally accepted boundaries and ways of experiencing altered status consciousness will also help us in transforming drug policy, because we'll have a clearer base from which to argue our points from, alongside evidence-based policy. And I think also being really fearless in standing up, and saying, I'm talking about drug policy or whatever, and I'm talking from personal experience. And if we all do that, as you said, then it's really hard to put everybody in jail, although they try. But, and being courageous.
We are in jail.
And also, I'm quite impressed that you are courageous enough to say in your bureaucratic meeting, that idea is from when I dropped acid last weekend.
They love me.
Do you find that they still take your ideas as seriously?
They're scared of me.
They're scared.
It's I can get away with it where a lot of people can't.
Why is that?
I'm scary. Believe me, I've dropped acid. Look out. I'm thinking what's interesting about culture is it's the verb. Culture is something we do, and the verb is to cultivate. We cultivate ourselves. I think that's something that sets us apart. We cultivate ourselves. We increasingly cultivate each other as well. Together, coming into these gatherings, as you say, we're learning how to look after each other. As we learn how to look after ourselves, we share that as well. And I'm just wondering, we're cultural agents in that sense. We create ourselves and we help each other keep a safe space for growing. Do we need to ramp up our role of being a cultural agent and get more people talking at work about the acid they dropped on the weekend and so on? What sort of people could do that, and where and how?
It's interesting. You talk to people that are working in alcohol and drug areas, say in treatment, or that they're actually a worker, and there are specific policies in their workplace that say they should never discuss their own substance use with their clients. So I'm not someone who works with clients, but I've had this discussion with some of those people who've said that back to me, that it is specifically stated not to do that. As a researcher, where you're actually doing an interview with someone, it also tends to be said, don't discuss your own use. But for me, I felt like it was useful to talk about, to situate who I was, who I am, and how I came to study the things that I study. But that on a one-on-one level. So it breaks the ice. It makes people think, I can talk about this freely with this person, that they're not going to judge me. However, I've had people talk back when I've talked about this issue with numerous people, as I have. They'll say, well, how about there's people out there studying, traumatic rape? Do they need to go rape to be able to speak on the subject? How can you say that? So there's been this sort of that's been an interesting argument back to me, and I said, well, I don't think you need to do drugs in order to talk about drugs, but we have to talk about this. So it's a tricky issue.
I think I disagree. I think if there's two people talking to me about drugs and drug policy, and one of them has no experience of drugs and one has a lot of experience, I think I'd listen a bit more closely to the person with a lot of experience.
Absolutely agree.
And same about rape.
Yeah.
If someone's talking to me about rape and they've experienced it versus someone who hasn't, I think I'd also have more respect for their opinion, because they're coming from a place of direct experience, which is what entheogens are all about.
But this is, I guess, from a counsellor saying, should I stop working with trauma people where I haven't experienced the trauma they have? Can I just use my empathy with trauma in general to understand it? So there might be people out there, and I'm thinking of a couple of my friends who've done, just a couple of our girlfriends who we talked to just recently with my husband and I at a party, and it surprised us that they'd actually never taken anything. We just had this discussion, and that they go along to the gigs, have a great time, really get into it, enjoy themselves, but for whatever reason they decided to stay free of all substances. And I thought, well, but they're experiencing something quite strong here anyway. So maybe we get there in different ways. Maybe some people take a different path but can still empathise.
I do wonder about baseline,
Yeah.
and how much we know about baseline. There's that lame argument, when you say, I have these wonderful experiences when I take drugs, and people say, well, I can have those experiences without drugs. And you wonder, well, if your baseline is like that,
Lucky you.
Yeah.
well, why would you prevent me from using drugs to get to those states that you already have? But how much do we know about baseline? Do we need to study the straight people a little bit more? Is there a research, a possibility to do useful research there?
I've got some friends, one in particular I can think of, who does astral travel without substances regularly, but I wouldn't call her a mainstream person. And I don't think you'll find, what you're referring to as mainstream, having those experiences. Otherwise they wouldn't be mainstream. But I think an important part of this process is just understanding that what we're really talking about is the process of change, and people have to be ready to change. And if you come across somebody who's clearly not ready to change their point of view, you can argue with them if you really want to, but it's probably not going to be worthwhile. It's going to be a waste of your time at the end of the day. So I think part of it is having discretion to sense where you feel an opening in somebody's worldview or opinions, and going, where there's an opportunity rather than trying to bang your head against a brick wall.
I'm thinking here about a Dutch word for in politics is spanningsveld. Spanningsveld is a field of tensions, and the tensions are what give a political discussion energy. And you get those tensions by having different people in the room. You've got to have a quorum to do politics. When the Dutch Parliament wanted to ban hacking, for example, they talked for a couple of years with people who hacked, because they were going to make this law that would make that illegal. So getting the right spanningsveld, getting all the tensions right so that it works. I think there's a French philosopher called Rancière who said that politics is getting a stage and making it big enough so that you can invite your enemy onto it. And I'm just wondering, what would that stage look like for drug policy? Who do we need to talk with?
I think the work that MAPS and PRISM are doing is a good example of that,
Mm-hmm.
where they really are engaging in the mainstream. And I must admit there was a time where I felt that was a waste of time, but seeing the progress that's happening, I think it's actually very worthwhile, and what it gives us is the opportunity to make advancements on all different fronts. So it's easy to talk and get acceptance amongst groups like us, but if we can also filter into the mainstream and find those opportunities, find places where we can make progress and we can change opinions, then that just adds to the overall momentum of the whole movement.
I think politicians often act from a moral platform as well, and I think that we could give more attention to our own moral platform, looking at the ethics and morality of entheogen use. I'm reminded of this psychedelic counterculture of the 60s and then the emergence of the idea of set and setting as guidelines for tripping. That set, the psychological state that's cultivated, is a moral state. If you have a coherent moral structure, then you're very likely to have a good psychedelic experience. So I think we can emphasise our own morality, our own ethics more, because that is kind of what politicians draw their energy from, is the moral strength that they've become dependent on.
Thinking about evidence, I'm thinking about the evidence of the Santo Daime Church in Brazil, where there is evidence that what they do results in good community and healthy people. Do we need more research of that sort? I mean, how much is out there?
Yeah, I think so.
Santo Daime is interesting because they are a very structured church-like group of entheogen takers, that it is easier for them to create a study like that and then present it in a way that's understandable and perceptible to the mainstream. And I don't know if this is true, but someone recently told me that Santo Daime has even been accepted by the Vatican as a legitimate form of Christian experience. I think and it comes back to the culture thing again, that's a very clearly defined culture that's easy to study as a group, whereas if we were to do a study on everyone here, everyone's so different and engages in entheogen use so differently and engages with their life so differently, it would be hard to come up with definitive data that could then be used, I think.
I think every situation is different too. I mean, Santo Daime is accepted in some countries, but there are Santo Daime leaders in the UK at the moment that have been prosecuted, in the process of being prosecuted. Is Mudge in the audience? Don't think he is. He's got the latest on it anyway. So it really is a matter of, I think, understanding what environment you're trying to make progress in and making an assessment and then acting accordingly. I don't think there's an across-the-board solution as such.
I wouldn't have thought of the Vatican, I must say. That's a pretty big stage.
We'll invite them next year.
Yes, well, we should do that. Right.
Mind you, what the Vatican says in South America is quite different from what the Vatican says in Europe. So their official position in Brazil is not necessarily their universal position.
So I guess I'm thinking about there's the stage of politics that we would create and what sorts of people we would invite on it, like the Pope and perhaps the Dalai Lama. But I'm wondering, other people are already on their political stages, and one of the ones that really sticks in my mind, when Judge Judy was in Australia about 10, 11 years ago, she was talking about heroin addicts, and the idea is that when you're addicted to heroin, you're no longer human because you've lost your agency. Heroin, you're a puppet of the heroin. And so her solution was give them dirty needles and let them die. Now there's a political stage, and I'm thinking, well, how would our community get up on that stage? What would we say? Would we have evidence, or would we talk values?
I would talk values against that. I mean, to let people die for what reason? I think you're right. Values are, I think, especially for politics. So I think in some of the ways that our sector, I guess that I belong in, the alcohol and drug research sector, produces all this evidence, and there's some fantastic evidence coming out. But then when you look at the Hansard scripts of what politicians talk about when they're talking drugs, they come back to the morality, and if the evidence fits with their morality, that they bring it in. If the evidence doesn't fit with their morality, they often just disregard it. So I think it does come back to morality on that question of each human being having the right to live and to have a good life, and to also question this idea of agency. There are other ways of living apart from being a rational kind of straight human being. There are different subjectivities. So in the Judge Judy example, she's in this idea that these people are worthless because they have no agency, or the idea that they even have no agency when clearly people can still go out and use heroin every day with agency. So a lot of these things need to be challenged.
I think a lot of what goes on with people like Judge Judy is just they say the most irritating things they can say, so they can grab your attention. I mean, if I started insulting everyone on the panel, I would get attention. Probably, maybe not.
One of the models of drug abuse is the hedonic allostasis model, that people want to be happy all the time, and that's basically the theory of their drug abuse, is they want to sustain a state of a particular mood that is satisfying for them. And I think that Judge Judy also is using her concepts and her values to sustain moods and motivations, and that's really what a lot of politics, what a lot of culture and what a lot of religion is about, is manipulating things so that you can sustain a particular mood that motivates you to particular actions. So these are all forms of dependency.
I think we need to use our discretion in terms of where we put our energy as well. I mean, if you look at Google as an example and the way that they've changed the way that the world accesses information and shares information, they didn't go to every government and lobby them to get permission to see whether they could do it. They just did it, you know. And if they tried that route through old-fashioned systems dealing with old-fashioned mindsets, they'd still be trying today. So I just caution against positioning ourselves in the old arguments and operating in that box when we're clearly outside the box.
So we should just do it?
We should just do it, I think.
We've all enjoyed having a mic here, but we'd like to listen as well, and I'm sure some of you have got things to say. Is there a roaming mic?
Yes, it's on the way to Greg right now.
I'd like to thank the panel first for that very polite conversation. I actually found the title of the entire panel to be quite ironic, because we're already past evidence-based policy. For those that many of you won't know who I am, my name's Greg Kasarik, and I've been campaigning this year quite intensively for the legalisation of what I call transcendent compounds. Now, I use that definition specifically, and transcendent compounds are the ones that are non-addictive, non-toxic, and psychologically safe. So they're the entheogens that are non-addictive, non-toxic, and psychologically safe. In other words, they are the gold standard of what we should be, or what, you know, if you can't have those legal, there's nothing you can do. But in campaigning, what I've done is I've gone and I've said, I'm using these. And I have a website on which I do say I'm using them. And yes, it has caused issues. I'm almost unemployable in my area of work because my referees are no longer referees, and I work in community services as a general rule, and it's difficult. But what I'm going to ask is how many people here have actually contacted their members of parliament and said these things need to be legal? I'm not talking about saying you use them, but you know, it's great to come here, but I'm continually reminded of the movie Life of Brian, where they're all sitting around going, something's got to change, and then, you know, the girl, whatever her name, comes in and says, Reg, something is actually happening. And we haven't got to that moment. At the moment, we're sitting around talking, and there's no action. Now, I've sort of got myself into a bit of a mess, and in about a week's time, I may very well be doing a hunger strike in the middle of Burke Street Mall, okay, because I told the government I'm sick and tired of their bullshit. The letters that I got back from, the responses I got back from are continually saying health and safety, at which point I say, no, non-toxic, non-addictive, psychologically safe. There is no health and safety issue here. Now, in Victoria, we now have the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. Section 14 of that grants full religious freedom. Section 7 of that requires the government to actually come to the party. So the government cannot ban any particular right. The government needs to, if they have a concern, they need to implement a mechanism. So I'm asking for regulated access to the transcendent compounds for religious purposes. But we need to get off our asses as a community and get in touch with the politicians, because I can tell you right now, until the politicians have people knocking on their door and have a reason to change, because the evidence can say whatever it can. You know, there could be a comet in the sky ready to kill us all. The politicians won't do a single thing about it until we, the people, make that a necessity. Thank you.
I think that's a great example of a not polite approach. Excellent example. And that, yeah, if we're all doing that, it'd be a lot more change happening.
There's a few hands up.
Well, the studies in MDMA and psilocybin are a logical strategy, the likes of CSP and MAPS and PRISM. I was wondering what the panel's views are on whether replicating the rat park studies in as many international jurisdictions and linguistic domains would be a much more efficient and effective strategy in terms of influencing drug policy, making more of a shift from the criminal model to the medication model. Just quickly, the rat park studies established that happy rats don't dose on opiates nearly as much as unhappy rats, and that has a vast implication for public policy. And also on that part, also finally getting the rat park studies into the archives of general psychiatry. Thank you.
Rats are cheaper than people.
I'm not too sure how that conclusion that happy rats don't have this, how does that translate into society? I mean, if governments knew how to make people happy,
well, I think.
Sorry, just to differentiate.
Yeah.
The rat park studies had
Yeah, well, I could probably.
you can do it.
Yeah.
The rat park study, which has not really been replicated very much, and so it's not clear how easily it is to replicate, is basically showed that. Well, maybe I'll take a little. I'll go insane, and then the main way that drugs of abuse are studied in animals is to actually forcibly give them drugs for a while, so that then when they take the drugs away, the rats or monkeys, whatever, want to re-administer them because they basically cracked out. And the rat park study was a different model where they gave the rats access to the, I actually don't remember which drug it was, but they also had food and sex and play as well. Instead of what most of the studies have is rats in a little tiny plastic box by themselves. And so they found that rats that had access to food and sex and play would do a little bit of whatever it was, heroin or cocaine, maybe it was cocaine. And then they'd go and have sex and they'd play and then they'd eat and then they'd sleep. But the rats who were stuck in a box basically spent all their time administering the drug to themselves. So, I think there are a lot of implications for that. I mean, the problem is that it's much more expensive and difficult to replicate studies where you have to let rats play rather than keeping them in a little plastic tray. And so, but most of the drug of abuse, most of the studies that show severe unhealthy self-application of recreational drugs are set up in a way that are designed to show that. And so it would be lovely if someone were to do lots more studies that weren't designed to show that.
I guess I'm just thinking here about how difficult it can be to use evidence even when we think it's there. One of the examples was people who used heroin in English towns. Young men who used heroin were dreadfully addicted until they became a dad and wanted access to their kids, and then they stopped using heroin. Is that evidence? What would it take to turn it into usable evidence?
It is evidence. Absolutely, it's evidence. And why isn't it usable evidence? I mean, the rat studies are showing that as well. And when you think about it, if you were alone in a little tray with nothing to do except push a lever with some stuff coming out that made you feel good, everyone would do that. I mean, what does it really prove?
Yeah.
And I think that study really helps to show. But I guess having researchers that are thinking outside of the square as it is will encourage this kind of research and this kind of innovation going forward, whether it be replicating those studies or more studies that get outside of the mould of just looking for the pathology in drugs, which is, I guess, a mould that many researchers that have been, socialised into for a long time, and that's sort of where they come from.
Lindy's got the mic.
We've got one here.
Yeah, one question.
Hi everyone. Really enjoying the discussion today. Something actually, Stephanie, you mentioned before was for the greater good, which I'd like to explore a bit more if we can in discussion. I'll start with a story of an experiment that was done a while back, which was on cats, where cats brought to the same cat were put into two groups. One group of kittens put into a happy, playful environment. Other group of kittens put into a hostile, aggressive environment, and then let the kittens grow up. Happy, playful cats, and then aggressive, hostile cats. Then they changed the experiment around. They took the cats brought up in the happy environment, they put them in the hostile environment, and they found they became fearful and withdrawn. When they got put back to the normal environment, they went back to being their happy, natural, happy cats. Now, the cats brought up in the hostile environment, when they got taken and put into the happy environment, they didn't change their behaviour. They remained the same way. When they got put back to the normal environment, they changed the surroundings, but it still took about 5 generations for those qualities to come out of the psychology. And so we see that in different places, even in Australia. Like my background is I finished medical school 7 years ago and did a lot of exploration afterwards. I'm in my last 4 months of my medical imprisonment, but I explore a lot of different things. I've worked up in the Northern Territory in Aboriginal communities where you see people had transgenerational trauma in terms of the psychology, where they use things like alcohol for connection. And then working in places like Barratt Bay, where you had the Aquarius movement years ago, and you've still got uses of different things in that place. And highest number of high functioning Asperger's that I've seen in Australia, which is, I think is an evolutionary process that's occurring. I'm currently working in drug and alcohol in King's Cross. I'm giving out methadone programs for people. I don't necessarily agree with what's happening. I think what would be ideally to be done would be to put people on farms and give them ayahuasca would be incredible. The thing that I'm kind of realizing though is that at the moment we still we can change the awareness of somebody and change their awakening, but they're still in the environment that they go back to that still does not support that change. You've got societies like, for example, like Argentina, where 1 in 13 people are psychoanalysts. When people go see a psychoanalyst, like they go see dentists, they look at mental health as a positive thing rather than something that is reactionary, which is what we have in Australia. I disagree with the psychology that exists in this country. I think it's very much still reactionary and very much problem focused. And that's definitely area we can explore as such. So the thing in terms of the greater good is the thing that I'd like to see in terms of drug policy, what your thoughts are as a panel. Because if we introduce these things at the moment, are we awakening people to a reality that they can actually explore and move forward with, or are we opening them up to still remain in a prison?
I think everyone here is probably, this discussion is specifically about drug policy and changing that, but I think we're all trying to actively engage in a broader societal and cultural change. And as you said, things are changing really fast around the world. And I think that's part of the way that we currently look at the world is very compartmentalized. So here we'll talk about drug policy, here we'll talk about mental health, these people over there will talk about physical health, and part of what we're breaking down, and I think needs to be broken down, is this compartmentalization. It's all part of one human experience. Use of entheogens, psychology, feelings of well-being. So somehow, I think, overcoming the fear as well. You're saying that people won't change till they're ready to change. I think what stops people from wanting to change is the fear. There's a really encultured and socialized fear of drugs in our culture, and that's why the debate and the discussion always ends up being about drug use being pathological, that it's a problem, or the harms of drugs. And then our argument gets dumbed down to be, drugs would be less harmful if they were legal, rather than talking about breaking through that fear. And yeah, drugs are really scary. I'm sure we've all had moments of being terrified, but that doesn't make it a bad thing. And trying to situate drug law reform into a broader change of society and culture.
Erik? Hey, just over this way, to your left. Thanks. I just wanted to take up the dude in the red shirt And some of the people on the panel who made comments about just kind of waiting for, you know, the old people to die off with their old ways and stuff. Because, the question was posed about engaging, and I think, you know, there's clear places where we can be engaging. Our old friend Karl Marx, I'm sure, be encouraging us to get on board with the Victorian Nurses Federation in their current battles. And, you know, I think there is an element of class consciousness that could be developed with these kind of questions. You know, it's in the Nursing Federation's interests to be, you know, like promoting these solutions to, you know, like they're often dealing with these kind of psychiatric problems which are out of their general fields. And wondered what, things like Erowid are obviously providing information to the general populaces, but yeah, I mean, Occupy was mentioned. Any of you actively engaging with the Occupy movement? I think it's a great forum where we could bring these kind of ideas to the people.
Well, I just wanted to clarify that just by saying that I think that it's a kind of part of the process that we need to have the generation that's in power have grown up with, or at least become adults in an environment where they've had access to recreational drugs, so that it isn't just talking about the aliens of people that they don't know. I wasn't saying don't do anything between now and then, but I mean, I'm a bit of an activist myself, so. Go out and do.
I think that people who take entheogens are mature enough to control their own lives and their own consciousness and their own mind without the laws that have been placed upon us by folks who are who believe they have the divine right to tell other people what to do. It all comes down to, do I own myself or do I not own myself? Do I own my own consciousness or do I not own my own consciousness? Does that mean that you have the right to tell me what to do with my body, even if it's jumping off the cliff or it's taking heroin or whatever? Do you have the right to tell me that? And we're going to have to face that, because there are people that are growing in the world today that are not going to take this patriarchal, I'm the father, I know what's best for you type of attitude and be governed by people who have an agenda, because I think on the end, he said that Days said that the politicians were moving from a moral ground. Maybe they moved morally in Australia, but in the United States, there's no morality in anything. They know exactly what they're doing. See, we look at this as these are some old guys who are trying to protect us, and they don't really know. They know what drugs do. Drugs change the paradigm and change your mind, which means it destroys the political foundation of which they stand. So if you know and understand that this drives part of the prison industrial complex, in other words, there's more people in drugs in the United States than there is anywhere else and for anything else. And it is about finance, it is about control, it has nothing to do with wanting to help or harm. They know exactly what these substances do, and it's on purpose. So what I'm saying is, we've been talking about getting outside of the box. To get outside of the box, we're gonna have to look at the way we view how the world is governed and the world is run, and change that model completely. I don't wanna see anybody telling anybody else what to do. As long as you're not harming anyone else, you do what you want to do. And that's really the guiding principle behind mature human beings. If I'm not harming you and I'm doing what I want to do, then, let me be. And that's what it's got to come down to, unless everyone here just likes someone else telling them what to do. The queen telling them what to do, the king telling them what to do, because God told the queen that she can tell you what to do. And we go for it. I think we should be adult enough now in our consciousness in the 21st century, with Google and with all the other things that are going on, to be mature enough to govern our own consciousness and our own bodies and minds.
I guess I'd say that that's what this entire panel discussion is about, is how do we get from here closer to there? It's not that there's, that there's disagreement exactly, but it's not, we can't just say, because we want that, let's do it. Okay.
Actually, I think we can.
We kind of did
And,
that.
I think there's probably lots of people here who are doing it already, despite the laws. We're being who we want to be, and we're living life the way that Kalindi just described. And I really do think that's the start. Is just to be the change, as they say.
I think there are many different angles to approach the conundrum from, and I think that it's important that we're approaching all of them, and that while on one hand in our private space we can be taking high doses of entheogens to affect the paradigm and the universal subconsciousness, it's also a valid and important thing to be, writing to your members of parliament and also approaching it from that angle. And I think perhaps that's where we have the greatest chance of really seeing transformation, is by really approaching from all those different angles.
And also, if you can see a window of opportunity in policy, I think that's the other metaphor that is useful to think about. So sometimes there is a confluence of events that comes together that means that a policy is more likely to be put through, or reform is more likely to happen. And if we're sort of right there looking for that window, then we can do what we need to do at the right time with the right people that actually have that.
And it does seem that window is now, in many ways.
And also we get to study the problem up close by engaging with them.
One of the, I actually don't see the world quite the way that you were describing it. You were, Kalindi was describing it, I think. Maybe you were saying that most of the politicians see the world in terms of sort of, they know that this is about power and control. And the way that I see it is that there's a very small portion, and I don't know what that portion is. Is it 2% or 10% or 15% or something like that, who see the world that way, but that most of the people most of the politicians are acting in good faith to some degree. And I have this thing I call the vice principal syndrome, mostly because of my unpleasant experiences in secondary school. But essentially, if you create a position, which is the enforcer position, the people who are most likely to fill that position are people who want to enforce rules over other people. And so what part of the problem is that we've got a system of control that that the society has set up that gets people into the positions that are making the decisions, who are people we really don't want as a society to make those decisions. And so the people who are aware of, are thinking in terms of using drug laws to control the population and using it to control the economic situation, are the people that we really don't want making those decisions. But that most of the people don't know that. Most of the people around them aren't as cynical about it as they are. Anyway.
Really, anyone who wants to be in a position of power could be automatically disqualified from being in that position.
Tim, there's a question over here in the middle.
I just wanted to know if the panel could speak to. I just wanted to know if the panel could speak to any progress that's gone on with the Attorney General looking at making a large number of plants illegal in this country.
I doubt that do any panel members have an update? Okay.
The last time I spoke to them, they just said that there was still too great a bulk of submissions and that they were working through it.
We overwhelmed them.
Yeah, it seems like they've been overwhelmed into inaction.
Now, I think Des is talking about that in a little more detail tonight, so 6 o'clock or so.
At 2 and 1, I will be speaking specifically on using ethics and morality, both as a culture change agent, but also to culture jam the opposition. And touching on the fact that though they didn't, or we didn't recognise it at the time, back in the 60s and early 70s, we actually were, if not in so many words, using ethics and morality in that fashion.
And doing harm to the paradigm, at least, I think, back in the 60s. Martin, how much time do we have?
We're pretty much out of time now, unless there's one urgent question. Tim,
Always an urgent question.
Tim, could you pop the mic back there?
It's a bit of a comment about it. I don't know how many of you know, but about a year ago, the Czech Republic made it legal to possess a small amount of psilocybin mushrooms, pot, and cactus. Some people have responded to this saying that perhaps they did it to take advantage of the tourist market that would have left the Netherlands with the criminalisation of mushrooms recently. I like to think that perhaps their motivations were a bit more broader than that. But yeah, it might be worthy to check to see what happened with the government in the Czech Republic to allow this stuff to be legal.
We'll check.
I'd just like to thank the panelists for sharing their views and interacting with each other, and thank you all for sharing and listening as well. I'm sure the discussions will continue. We're all here to share, so if you do want to keep talking, we're here for the weekend. Come and talk with us. Thank you all.